He hadn't touched a woman in 35 years, not a hand held, not a cheek brushed, not even the accidental graze of fingers. Aaron knew the number exactly because he'd counted every year since the night she left. It was raining hard, he remembered that. She didn't take much, just her clothes, her perfume, and the warmth from the house. The slam of the door was louder than the thunder. If you're a true Wild West soul, drop a big yes in the comments. Let's see who's still riding the trail with us. Now he was 62, and the only warmth he knew came from the breath of his cows and the dim barn light. His life had shrunk to the rhythm of their milking, the scrape of the pail, the heavy silence between the beats of his own heart. Every morning began before the sun. Mist wrapped the flat Dutch fields in a damp shroud, the kind that clung to his coat and seeped into his bones. He trudged across the yard, boots sinking into the soft earth, the smell of manure and wet hay thick in the air. It was a smell he no longer noticed. It was simply the air he breathed. The cows greeted him with low, patient sounds. They were his only companions now, and they had been for decades. He knew each by name, though he never spoke them aloud anymore. There was no one to hear him. When the milking was done, he stood at the wooden gate, staring out over the polder. The horizon was endless and empty, like the years ahead. People in the village whispered about him, he knew. The old farmer who never smiled, the man whose life had stopped in 1990. He didn't mind their stories. It was easier than explaining the truth, that he had once loved, and that love had left, and that in leaving it had taken every reason to try again. Inside the farmhouse, the silence was thicker than the fog outside. The walls held no laughter, no conversation, only the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. On the shelf above the fireplace, dust coated the space where her photographs once stood. He had put them in a box in the attic years ago, thinking he would take them out again one day. He never did. Sometimes, late at night, he tried to remember what her skin felt like under his hand, but the memory had faded into something distant and unreal, like a dream you try to recall after waking. He feared that even if she stood before him now, he wouldn't know how to touch her. The day stretched ahead of him, as all days did, long, empty, and predictable. He buttoned his coat and stepped outside, the cold air biting his face. The sun was climbing over the horizon, pale and weak. Another day had begun, another day alone. They spoke of him in lowered voices, as though the mere mention of his name might summon him from the shadows. In the cafe on the corner, between the smell of fresh coffee and the scrape of teaspoons on porcelain, he was a subject as familiar as the weather. The old farmer, they would say, eyes drifting to the window that looked toward the polder. Lives out there all alone, doesn't talk to a soul. No one could quite agree on the details. Some swore he had once been the most charming man in the village, the kind who could make a girl blush just by looking at her. Others claimed he'd been a quiet one even then, but with a certain warmth in his smile that made you feel seen. They all agreed on one thing: something had happened, something that took the light out of him. At the bakery, the women would lean over the counter, voices hushed, telling the newcomers what they had heard from their mothers. How he used to dance at the village fairs, spinning his wife under the strings of fairy lights until her hair came loose. How the two of them were inseparable, a love story that made others jealous. And how, one autumn night, she was simply gone. No one knew why. There were stories, of course, that she had run away with a man from the city, that they had lost a child, that she had tired of the long winters and endless work. The truth was locked away behind Aaron's weathered face, and he never offered it to anyone. When he came into the village, rarely, and only for supplies, people would watch him from the corner of their eyes. He walked with a slow, steady gait, shoulders slightly stooped, as if carrying the weight of something no one could see. He spoke only when necessary, his voice low and flat. Sometimes, if you looked closely, you might catch a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of the man he once was. But it was gone before you could be sure. Children whispered that his house was haunted. Teenagers dared each other to cycle past his farm at night, claiming they'd seen a figure in the upstairs window. The older villagers shook their heads at such foolishness, but even they crossed the street if they happened to meet him walking into town. And yet, in the quiet moments, when gossip gave way to reflection, there was a shared, unspoken sadness in their words. They remembered him as he had been. They wished, though they would never admit it, that someone, somehow, might find a way to reach him. For 35 years, no one had tried. That was about to change. The frost still clung to the grass when Aron stepped out of the barn that morning, his breath hanging in the air like a ghost. The world was quiet in that way only autumn mornings could be, cold, still, waiting. He had just finished the milking when he heard it, the crunch of bicycle tires on the gravel path. He frowned. No one ever came up this far, unless they were lost. The figure that emerged through the pale mist was not what he expected. A young woman, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, hair spilling messily from under a woolen cap. She was breathing hard from the long ride, but her eyes, bright, curious, met his without hesitation. "You're Aron, right?" she said, stepping off her bike. Her voice was light but sure, cutting through the morning stillness. He gave a slow nod, wary, his hands tightening around the wooden handle of the bucket he carried. "I'm Sanne," she continued. "I'm studying veterinary medicine in Utrecht. We have to get practical experience with livestock for our course. I was told you have cows." He almost laughed, though the sound caught in his throat. Have cows. He had 73. They were his only company. She took a step closer, her boots sinking into the damp earth. "I was hoping maybe you could teach me how to milk them." For a moment, all he could do was stare at her. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and he noticed she didn't look away like most people did. She wasn't afraid of him, not yet. That unsettled him more than her sudden appearance. "You can't just walk onto someone's land," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Her smile faltered, but only for a second. "I know, but no one else in the area would let me. They said you might need an extra pair of hands." He wondered who had told her that. Nobody in the village spoke kindly of him, not that he cared. She looked past him toward the barn, where the warm, sweet smell of hay drifted into the morning air. "Please, I'll work hard. I want to learn." Something in her tone, earnest, almost pleading, pressed against a part of him he had long boarded up. He wanted to say no, to send her away before she disturbed the fragile stillness he'd built over decades, but he didn't. Instead, he found himself stepping aside, motioning toward the barn. "Cows are already milked for the morning," he said. "You can watch this afternoon." Her face lit up like the first light breaking through clouds. As she wheeled her bike toward the barn, he felt an unease he hadn't known in years. Not fear exactly, but something far more dangerous. Hope. The barn was warmer than the air outside, the low afternoon sun casting long golden beams through the dust that floated lazily in the air. Aron stood by the feed bins, arms crossed over his chest, watching Sanne brush hay from her coat. She was already talking about how she could help, how she could start right away, how she'd even come before sunrise if needed. "No," he said, cutting her off. His voice was quiet but firm, like a door being shut. "I don't need help." Sanne looked up at him, her hand still on the zipper of her jacket. "You don't understand." "I understand fine," he interrupted. "You've got your school, your life. Go find another farm. This one's not for you." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. He turned away, busying himself with the feed, pretending not to see the way her shoulders stiffened. People had always been easier to deal with when he kept his back to them, especially women. They came with questions, with looks he didn't know how to answer. Sana didn't leave. Instead, she took a slow step closer. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "That's the point," he muttered. She tilted her head, studying him like one might study a stubborn animal that had kicked the bucket one too many times. "You're afraid I'll get in the way, or maybe you're afraid I won't." The remark struck harder than he expected. He kept his eyes on the grain he was measuring, but his hand had stilled. "I've worked with animals since I was 14, she continued. "I can shovel manure, clean stalls, carry feed. I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here to learn. And you—" She hesitated, but her voice stayed steady. "You look like you could use someone to talk to, even if it's just the cows." Her persistence unsettled him. Most people gave up after his first no. That was the way it had always been. One sharp refusal and they'd vanish like mist. But she stood there, calm, determined, as if she had all the time in the world. "I said no," he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. She smiled faintly, not mocking, but patient. "Then I'll come back tomorrow, and the day after, until you say yes." For a long moment, the barn was silent except for the soft, steady breathing of the cows. Aron's gaze drifted to the door, where the late sunlight painted everything in gold. He hated the idea of someone stepping into the quiet rhythm he'd guarded for 35 years. And yet a part of him, a small, treacherous part, wondered what it would hurt to let her stay just for a while. But he didn't say that. "Do what you want," he muttered, turning back to his work. "Just don't get under my feet." Sana's smile deepened, though she hid it well. She knew she had just won her first battle. The morning air was sharp enough to sting his lungs as Aron stepped into the barn. The frost on the grass outside still glittered in the pale dawn light. He'd been up for hours, but he lingered before opening the door, knowing she'd be waiting. Sana was already there, leaning against the wooden wall, her breath curling in white clouds. She wore an old knitted hat pulled low over her ears and gloves with frayed fingertips. When she smiled at him, it was small, cautious, like she knew she'd pushed too far yesterday, but wasn't about to take it back. He gave her a short nod, said nothing, and walked to the first stall. The cows shifted and snorted softly, their warm bodies filling the air with a heavy, sweet scent. "Wash your hands," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. She obeyed without question, moving quickly to the sink in the corner. The metal pail clanged gently as he set it down. He crouched beside the first cow, his hands working with practiced ease, and the steady rhythm began. The soft squeeze and release, the stream of milk hitting the bucket with a warm, frothy sound. Sana watched for a while, silent, her eyes following every movement. When he gestured for her to try, she knelt beside him, her fingers awkward and stiff. The first attempt drew only a thin dribble. "Not like that," he said, his hand hovering over hers but not touching. "Firm but gentle, like you mean it." She adjusted her grip, bit her lip, tried again. The sound of milk splashing into the bucket came in hesitant bursts. He didn't praise her, but he didn't scold either. Minutes stretched into something slower, softer. The barn seemed to breathe with them, the low rumble of the cows and the hiss of milk filling the silence. Every now and then her sleeve brushed his, and he shifted slightly away, though not as sharply as he might have before. She broke the quiet first. "Do you ever talk to them?" His eyes stayed on the bucket. "They don't need talking to. They know what to do." "I think they'd like it," she said. "They have kind eyes." He didn't answer, but when she turned back to her work, he let his gaze linger on the curve of her smile, faint and focused. By the time the last pail was full, the sun had climbed high enough to throw long shadows across the barn floor. Sana stood and stretched, brushing stray strands of hair from her cheek. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. He hesitated, the no sitting ready on his tongue. But instead he gave a short nod. She grinned, and for a brief, fleeting moment, something warm stirred in the cold, locked place inside him. The mornings began to feel different. Arend still rose before dawn, still pulled on the same worn jacket and heavy boots, but the barn no longer seemed so empty. Sanna was always there before him now, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes bright even in the dim light. She moved as if she belonged among the cows, her boots leaving small tracks in the straw. At first he kept his words short, answering her questions with nods or one-syllable replies, but she never seemed put off by his silence. She asked about the feed, about the way the milking machines worked, about how to tell when a cow was ill. Little by little, he found himself answering in sentences, then in stories, small ones, about the seasons, about the time a storm had knocked down the old maple by the gate, about a calf born in the middle of the night during the first snow. Sanna listened without interrupting, her eyes following him, as if every word he spoke mattered. She asked questions no one had asked him in years, not about the work, but about him. "Did you grow up here? Was your father a farmer too?" The first few times he deflected, but she didn't push. She just waited, and one morning, without realizing why, he told her about the day his father handed him the keys to the farm. How proud he'd been, how heavy the responsibility had felt. One afternoon, as they finished cleaning the stalls, she bent down to scratch behind the ears of one of the older cows. "She likes you," Sanna said. "They all like me," he replied, half smiling before he caught himself. She looked up at him then, that smile of hers warm enough to thaw something inside him. "I think they like you because you take care of them," she said softly. He didn't know what to say to that. No one had spoken to him like that in a long time. Not since before everything changed. By the end of the week, the silences between them felt less heavy. They worked side by side, the rhythm of the farm settling into something almost companionable. Once, when she slipped on the wet floor and nearly fell, he caught her by the arm. His hand lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, the warmth of her skin startling him. That night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, he caught himself thinking about the way she laughed when she managed to get a stubborn cow to move. He shook his head, as if to push the thought away. But it stayed. Somewhere in the quiet of those days, the ice around him had begun to crack. He didn't know yet if he wanted it to break completely, but he no longer felt sure that he didn't. It began with a smell. Sanna had brought fresh bread one morning, still warm from her mother's oven. When she sliced it, the air filled with that rich, yeasty scent, and without warning, Arend was 22 again, standing in the tiny kitchen of his first home, watching Mariki pull a loaf from the oven. She had looked up at him then, her face framed by loose strands of hair, and smiled the kind of smile that made a man feel like the only person in the world. The memory lingered like a ghost all day. He tried to push it away, but Sanna's laughter, light, unguarded, pulled more of the past into the present. He remembered the way Mariek used to tease him when he came in from the fields, his boots leaving clumps of mud on the floor. How she'd roll her eyes, then kiss him anyway. There had been so much laughter in those early years. The farm was small, their bank account smaller, but they'd had each other. He remembered summer evenings on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the sun sink into the horizon. He remembered the winter storms when the power went out and they'd light candles, her face flickering in the glow. But memory is never gentle for long. Just as the sweetness began to warm him, the darker images came. The mornings when she grew quiet, distant, the nights when she didn't come home from town until late. The final morning, cold, gray, when she stood in the doorway with her suitcase, unable to meet his eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Arend," she had said. And then she was gone. The years after had been a kind of winter that never thawed. He had buried himself in the work, in the relentless rhythm of the seasons, until there was no space left for anyone else. People stopped calling, stopped visiting. He stopped noticing. Now, watching Sanna move through the barn, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind her ear, he felt the sharp ache of what he had lost. She was nothing like Marieka, and yet something about her, the way she listened, the way she made the silence feel alive instead of empty, pulled those memories to the surface, whether he wanted them or not. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table long after the sun had set, staring at the steam curling from his coffee. The house felt less empty than it had in years, but that frightened him more than the loneliness ever had, because memories were dangerous things. They had the power to warm you and to burn you to ash. He told himself it was just the past playing tricks, but deep down he knew it was Sanna. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure if he wanted to keep the door closed. The rain came hard and sudden, like a curtain dropping over the fields. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old slate, and the wind howled around the corners of the barn. Sanna had just finished bedding the stalls when the first clap of thunder rattled the roof. She looked toward the open doors where the rain now fell in thick, slanted sheets. "I don't think I'm cycling home in that," she said, half laughing, but her eyes were wide. Arend didn't answer right away. He was leaning against a post, watching the storm with that stillness he carried everywhere. Finally, he said, "You'd best stay here until it passes." His voice was gruff, but there was something else beneath it, something almost uncertain. The power went out just after dark. The barn was lit only by a single lantern swinging from a beam, casting long shadows that shifted with every gust. The air smelled of hay, rain, and the damp warmth of the cows. They sat on overturned buckets in the center aisle, the storm roaring outside like the sea. For a long while they said nothing. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Arend could feel the words pressing at him, the way a swollen river presses against its banks. Sanna sat across from him, her knees drawn up, watching him the way you watch someone you're trying to understand. "It was 35 years ago," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. His voice sounded strange in the closeness of the barn. "She left in the morning. Didn't say much, just packed her things and went. Marieka." Sanna didn't speak. She just tilted her head slightly, waiting. "I wasn't enough," he went on. The words came slow, like each one had to be pulled from somewhere deep. "The farm was everything to me. Too much, maybe. She wanted more than cows and mud and quiet fields. Wanted music, people, light. I thought she'd get tired of all that and come back." He gave a small, bitter laugh. "She never did." The storm cracked above them, making the lantern sway. Arend stared at the straw between his boots. "After that, I just stopped. Didn't see the point in letting anyone close again. People can't leave if you never let them in." The silence that followed was different, heavier but warmer somehow. Sanna shifted, setting her bucket aside, and sat next to him. She didn't touch him, but her nearness felt like it filled a space he hadn't realized was empty. "You've let me in," she said softly. He almost told her she was wrong, almost, but the words wouldn't come. Outside, the rain eased, but inside, something else had begun to stir. Something he wasn't sure he could push back into the dark. The morning after the storm was the kind of morning that felt almost unreal. The air was washed clean, smelling of wet earth and grass, and the fields shone under a pale gold light. Drops of rain still clung to the fence posts, glittering like tiny beads. Arend stood at the edge of the yard, his boots sinking slightly into the softened ground, watching the mist rise from the fields. It had been years since he'd noticed a morning like this. From the barn came the sound of Sanna humming softly. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it was steady and warm, like the rhythm of work well done. She was already with the cows, moving confidently between them, a bucket in one hand, her braid swinging with each step. He lingered at the doorway for a moment, unseen, simply watching. It startled him the way he felt. For so long, mornings had been identical, quiet, gray, and heavy. Now there was something different, an energy that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't just the weather, it was her. "Morning," she said when she noticed him, smiling like the storm had never happened. "Your girls are in a good mood today." "They like you," he said before he could stop himself. The word sounded strange to his own ears, softer than usual. She laughed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. They worked side by side, the only sounds the soft hiss of milk in the buckets, the shuffling of hooves, and the occasional lowing of a cow. Aron found himself answering her questions without hesitation, about the best way to tell when a cow is about to calve, about the smell of fresh-cut silage, about the winter when the ditches froze solid. He even told her about the time, long ago, when the whole village would come to skate behind the church. Sanna listened as if every word mattered. She didn't rush him, didn't look for a way to turn his stories into her own. It had been decades since anyone had done that. When the milking was done, she walked with him to the pasture, their boots leaving deep prints in the softened soil. A few gulls wheeled above the fields, their calls sharp in the quiet. He realized with a faint surprise that he didn't want her to leave. At the gate, she turned to him. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. He hesitated. Old habits still clung to him like burrs, but then he nodded. "Tomorrow." As she cycled down the lane, her figure growing smaller against the brightening horizon, Aron felt something he hadn't felt in 35 years. Not joy exactly, not yet, but the faint, cautious stirring of it, like the first green shoot pushing up through thawed ground. The cow shifted restlessly, flicking her tail with an impatient snap. Sanna stood beside her, brow furrowed, both hands on the milking stool as if bracing herself for a fight. Aron watched for a moment, leaning on the stall door. "She's not stubborn," he said quietly. "She's testing you. Cows do that." Sanna looked up at him, a strand of hair stuck to her cheek. "And what do I do?" He stepped forward, moving slowly so as not to spook the animal. "Here," he said, crouching down beside her. "You've got to be firm, but calm. Put your hand here. No, like this." And then it happened. His hand closed gently over hers, guiding her fingers to the right spot, the warmth of her skin seeping into his. It was nothing, a practical gesture, a simple correction. But for Aron, it was everything. A jolt ran through him, not sharp, but deep, like something breaking loose inside after being locked away for decades. Her hand was warm, steady, alive. He hadn't touched a woman in 35 years. The barn seemed to hold its breath. He could hear the slow chew of the cow's jaw, the faint rattle of rain still dripping from the gutters outside, and his own heart, heavier than it had any right to be. His fingers lingered a fraction too long before he pulled them away. Sanna didn't seem to notice the depth of it. She only smiled, adjusting her grip on the stool. "Like this?" she asked. "Yes," he said, his voice quieter than he meant. "Exactly like that." They worked in silence after that, but it wasn't the old silence of closed doors and unspoken words. This one was softer, shared. Every now and then, he caught himself glancing at her, not in the way of a man looking at a woman he desires, but in the way of someone who has just remembered what it means to be connected, however briefly, to another human being. When the stubborn cow was finally done and the bucket full, Sana leaned back with a satisfied sigh. "Not so bad once you know the trick," she said. He almost told her then, about how her presence had cracked something open in him, about how that small, accidental touch had reached deeper than she could ever know. But instead, he only gave a small nod. "You did well," he said. As she left the barn, her boots leaving damp prints on the worn floor, Arend stood for a long moment with his hands still at his sides, as if holding the echo of that warmth. Outside, the air was sharp and bright after the storm. He stepped into it slowly, carrying a quiet truth in his chest. He was still alive. And for the first time in 35 years, he could feel it. That's the end of the trail, folks. Drop a yes if you're a true Wild West fan. Thanks for riding with me.